Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Laura Ulrich. I am a senior regional economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. I'm actually located in our Charlotte, North Carolina office, and I'm joined here with Jacob Walker. Jacob is a research analyst out of Richmond, and we've been working on a project now for about 3 years that looks at working to kind of redefine how some community college outcomes are measured, and part of our work is in the dual enrollment space. So we're going to talk about kind of why we got into this work, what we've done so far, and the outcomes of the dual enrollment part of our survey. The views that we're going to express are ours alone and don't represent an official position of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. So that goes for Jacob and myself. So I'm gonna skip over. We're gonna do a poll in just a minute, but I'm gonna skip that first and get into a little bit about what we've been doing. So this is our core team that we started with. This was about 3 years ago, as I mentioned, we started doing this work, and it started out with a mighty team of 3. We have now grown to be about a team of 8 or 9, depending on how you count us. And the research on community colleges has really become a priority for our president, Tom Barkin. And so one of the first things I want to really jump into is why we're interested in this. Why does the Federal Reserve care about community colleges? Why are we interested in community colleges? This is actually a question we get asked a good bit when we're out about, especially meeting with community colleges themselves. We frequently hear, like, I didn't know the Fed was interested in community colleges, or I didn't know you guys did community college work. And this really comes down to the mandate of the Federal Reserve. We have what's called a dual mandate. So one side of our mandate is very well known, I would say, by the public, which is, the Federal Reserve conducts monetary policy to keep prices stable and to keep interest rates moderate and stable over the long run. People know about that, especially right now, especially because of the inflation that we've been having. But what is not as well known is what we call the workforce or employment side of our mandate, which says that the Federal Reserve should also conduct this monetary policy to work towards achieving maximum employment. So maximum employment is not explicitly defined. Our price stability goal it's 2% inflation as an average over the longer term. But maximum employment is not an explicit goal. So a lot of the time we spend in research is working towards this concept of maximum employment, which doesn't just mean a low unemployment rate, but it also means people getting into the jobs that best use their skills, right, to try to maximize economic resources. So the work we do on community colleges is squarely on the workforce side, maximum employment side of our mandate. So, this is a graphic that I had our folks put together this past year that explains kind of what we're interested in and why we're doing this work. So the way that I think about this and that the team thinks about this is really there's kind of 2 pipelines. There's an education pipeline and there's a workforce pipeline. And we're interested in how people transition from the education pipeline to jobs, right, to the workforce. And people can make all sorts of choices along this education pipeline. They could choose all the way and go get a professional degree. They could choose to drop out of high school, and really anywhere in between. And from an economic point of view, in theory at least, all of these exits, maybe except for that no high school diploma, can result in family sustaining wages, right? You can go and get a short-term credential, some cases a very short-term credential, and still result in a family sustaining wage. But the issue is that people leak out of this pipeline. So we know from data, and I'll show you a picture of some of this data in just a second, that people who have consumed less education are more likely to never make it to that workforce pipeline. They're more likely to leak out the bottom. One of the things that we find that's really interesting is there is now more and more pressure from employers to kind of seal up this pipeline, because the reality is that with the demographic shifts we all know about and other changes in the economy, this leaky pipeline, which has always been leaky, but it now is not producing enough workers, right? We now have more jobs available in the economy than we have people who are working or looking for work. So kind of shoring up these leaks is becoming more important, and I would argue as an economist is going to become more important. But one of the things that one of the reasons why we really dove into this community college research is because we also recognized, once we started doing more and more analysis on this and more policy research, that most of the policies surrounding education are focused on the right-hand side of this pipeline. So much of the way we fund fund higher education, evaluate higher education, evaluate the students who attend higher ed, are really based on four-year degrees and beyond. And so we are interested as this team in looking at, from the short-term credential to the associate degree, how are community colleges serving folks in this pipeline? And the reasons for this are pretty clear from an economic perspective. The more education you consume, the higher the income you're going to have. So this relationship is clear and has never changed. Those that have less than a high school diploma have the lowest wages, and those that have graduate degrees have the highest wages. But once again, as I said, this doesn't mean that everybody needs to go get a graduate degree, right? Now, the returns to that are going to be higher, but for many people, that's not within their choice matrix, or it's not what they would choose to do, and they still can earn that family sustained wage, like I mentioned, at these other education levels. But the pipeline's leaky. So this is labor force participation rates by education level. Labor force participation is the percentage of adults that are either working or looking for work. And you can see here that, especially for those with less than a high school diploma, this has just been consistently between 45 to 50%. So less than 50% of people without a high school diploma are in the workforce or in the labor force. And then for the other education strata here, so high school graduate, less than bachelor's and bachelor's degree and higher, you can see that they all have declined slightly kind of over time, especially that high school graduate since COVID. But the relationship between these has remained. If you took this back as far as it's measured, there's never been a crossing of these lines. The more education people consume, the higher their labor force participation rates are. So this is really our lens that we come to this work with. So we are thinking about this from a workforce point of view. So we're looking at how do we get better workforce outcomes from community colleges, not from community colleges, but how do community colleges play a role in improving workforce outcomes? So I want to spend a little time here talking about the current national data. And I will say, and Jacob will describe our survey more and tell you a lot more about it. But the dual enrollment part of our survey is just one part of it. We think it's one of the most important parts of it because of the data we're collecting, but we also are collecting data on how schools are serving all students. So what percentage of students are getting any sort of credential, getting a certificate, graduate with an associate degree. And one of the reasons why this research is important to us, and one of the reasons why we have put so many resources into it, is that we have had trouble as an organization comparing the states in our district to each other at the community college level. So in our district, the Federal Reserve District, the 5th district, that includes the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia, and DC. So there's 12 Federal Reserve banks across the country. We are one of them. I will go ahead and give you one of the punchlines in case you're outside of that district, because I want you to listen to what we have to say. We are planning on expanding outside of our district with this work. So if you're in another state, we do plan on starting to collect that data probably in 2025. But anyway, our president was trying to look at all of the outcomes of community colleges across the states in our district. So how do outcomes in Maryland compare to Virginia, for example? And in looking at that outcome state data, we realized and we knew that the four-year institutions were pretty well measured by the IPEDS data, but the community colleges were not. And there's a stat that I use to describe kind of why that is, that I think does a good job outlining this. So if you look especially at graduation rate data and the cohort that is used to create the graduation rates by IPEDS, It uses a full-time, first-time cohort, so it's really looking at just full-time, first-time students. In the state of Virginia, at Washington and Lee University, 97% of their freshmen last year were in that cohort. So 97% of Washington and Lee students were full-time students taking 12 or more credit hours, and it was the first time they had been in college. At Virginia Tech, it was 85%, so less, but it's still pretty good. But at Tidewater Community College in Virginia, it was 35%. So there's so many fewer full-time students, right? There's so many fewer first-time students. But this is just one example of how we were able to really highlight to our president that community colleges are serving a very different population than four-year institutions. And so to measure them in the same way is maybe a choice that doesn't fully allow them to describe the services that they're providing. So this data from IPEDS, and I'm assuming everybody on this call knows this, but I'm going to tell you just in case you don't. IPEDS is the national database from the Department of Education that all higher education institutions are required to report to every year. And they historically have not included a special carve out for dual enrollment students. So you can search and get certain data by age, but you're not able to see whether or not students are dual enrollment. I did see in next year's data, they are starting to collect a little bit of dual enrollment data, but just a little bit. So states are collecting tons of data on dual enrollment students, right? But the problem is, as I mentioned, we're trying to compare across states, and that becomes very difficult because each state defines things slightly differently, right? And there's not it's not being collected at the federal level. So, but this data here shows the percent of all headcount enrollment that is under age 18. And it compares 2000 to 2022. And it's not surprising probably to anybody on this call, although it would be surprising, I think, to kind of the general population that the number, the percentage of students that are high schoolers, that and many of which are included in this under 18 at both community colleges and four-year colleges has really increased, but that increase is much more substantial at community colleges. So in 2022, 18.6% of headcount enrollment was under age 18. But this is not a great measure for dual enrollment, right? Because quite obviously, not all high schoolers are under age 18, and not everyone under age 18 is a high schooler. So that is why we wanted to collect our own data on dual enrollment students, so that we could have better measures of exactly how these students are performing. From a research standpoint, as we got deeper into this, it was so interesting to us, especially in the rural parts of our district, how important community colleges were to the K through 12 framework and in ecosystem in those communities. We heard regularly as we did a lot of outreach with these schools that the community college was able to really fill in gaps for K through 12, right? Like they weren't able maybe to offer AP English or IB math or whatever at the high school due to either lack of demand or the inability to recruit a teacher to pay that to teach that. And so the community college offering it really played a tremendous role. But in the same token, those organizations did not always have very good data on exactly how those students were performing, especially the school districts didn't always have a great feel for exactly how worthwhile these programs were, how efficient they were. Are they worth the money that either the school district or the state or whoever is paying for it? So I just want to, for real quick, if you will take out your phones, I am going to do a survey. I want to see just a couple things. This won't take very long at all. But if you will go to the website Menti, MENTI, is at the top of this website, if you see it there, and there's a code there. If you'll put in that code, I want to do this quick survey. I'll give people just a second. So MENTI.com, and there should be space for the code. And that code is 5980265. confusing has the most so far. Access, okay. Hodgepodge, I like that one. Scattershot, I like that. Reactive, these are great. Rigid. Okay, feel free to keep putting them in there, but I'm gonna go to the next slide just for the sake of time. I'm curious if you or any of your children have ever taken a dual enrollment course. So for you or your kids, have you ever taken a dual enrollment course? So that choices were yes, no, or no, but it wasn't available. It was available or it wasn't available. And I know everybody on here knows a lot about dual enrollment courses. So I'm curious if you guys took them yourself or your kids took them. Really interesting. So this is one of the things that we are I know in the word cloud there was some mention of inequities and things that things not being evenly distributed, and you can see even in this poll that it wasn't available for many students. Really interesting. Okay, what about AP or IB classes? I kind of suspected this might be the case actually with this group, with researchers, that a lot of us research or work in community colleges or dual enrollment, but we're not necessarily consumers of the product in some ways. Interesting. Okay, and the last one is, in how many states are high school students guaranteed to be able to take dual enrollment courses at a local community college tuition free? So out of 50 states, a couple more seconds for people to put them in there before I show you the right answer. Okay, so the answer was actually higher than a lot of people thought. At last count, and this changes all the time, so it literally could have changed while I was doing this. There could be a new policy that was passed. But at last count, it was 27. In 27 states, students can take classes tuition free. In our district and in the data we're going to show you today, in none of the states that we had data for this past year, in none of them could you take them completely free, but that has changed recently. North Carolina is in our district, and students can take those classes free. And we'll talk more about North Carolina in a minute. But West Virginia and Maryland are in our district, and they both changed policies this past year. So we'll get kind of a pre-post result for them. But in all of the states in our survey for this past year, in our extended pilot of our survey, students may have to pay something. So there are school districts and community colleges that are offering it tuition free, but that is not the norm across the state. And as economists, we are really interested in how people make decisions, how institutions make decisions. So that whether or not students are paying, we found was very important in the data that we were able to collect. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jacob for him to kind of describe what our journey has been on this project, and then he can show you our data.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of how did we get to developing the survey and kind of the input we got. So Laura can get to the next slide. So it started like we wanted this to be a survey for community colleges by community colleges. So it was very important for us to get input from some schools in our district. So we started out by having some long, in-depth conversations with various schools across our district. You can see in the table to the right that we talked to 10 schools of varying sizes, and we also got an even split of rural versus urban schools because we really wanted to understand how schools serve their community, which for urban and rural institutions are very different. And also when you look by size, it's very different. Also, how do community colleges define their own success? It's a big portion of what we do with the survey, and also the makeup of their student body. So that's where we heard a lot about dual enrollment also, and why we want to capture it in our survey. When we really wanted, and so after we came and had these conversations with these schools, we kind of went through the conversation notes and the data and saw what was like consistently like some holes in the currently publicly available data that we could patch. So that's kind of how we developed the instrument and how and figure out what metrics we wanted to collect. And I'll talk about like specifically what we're collecting in a few slides, but Laura, if you can go to the next slide. So specifically the goal with like our goals in creating this program, again, we wanted something community college focused, so something for community colleges, specifically talking about how they have a unique value add to the higher ed ecosystem. We want something that's independent. The Richmond Fed is not a funder of community colleges. We, like Laura said, we're really purely coming from this at a workforce angle. So we felt like we could add some value there because we really just want to help schools with workforce outcomes. Universally available, so we are working hopefully by next year to have, or this year maybe, yeah, this year. Thank you, Laura. To have all the data that we collect from schools available online for researchers, practitioners, decision makers to use. We want it also to design a program that's not burdensome. So we're working with institutional researchers across our district, and they have a lot of things on their plate. So we didn't want to add too much. So we very much are collecting what we think is the most important. Longevity. So we plan on doing this year over year for the foreseeable future. So developing a panel so researchers can do meaningful research and we can see trends over time and help policymakers and other decision makers figure out the best way that community colleges make decisions around community colleges, I should say, and help with choices. And then we were really interested in good coverage. So currently we had, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but we had the majority of the states in our district participate. So we have a wide variety of different community colleges across different states so we can do comparisons. So it's kind of, so these 6 things are kind of like the goals that we set out with trying to create this program. So yeah, next slide, Laura. So what are we collecting? So we're collecting data on credit students, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I want to kind of spend the most amount of time on our dual enrollment data. But for credit students, we're looking at enrollment. We're looking at student success, so student outcomes. One of our headline metrics is the Richmond Fed success metric, where we're kind of looking at community college success beyond the graduation rate. So looking at that to include people transferring to 4-year institutions before finishing their associates, or people who are persisting, so they're still in good standing, but maybe they didn't finish within the traditional time frame. And then we're also looking at total awards granted by the institution, also the total number and total successful number of credit hours completed by students. We also look at retention rates, and then for non-credit students, this is a little bit messier and a whole lot harder to collect data on, but we are trying to get kind of a good understanding of what enrollment looks like for those programs and how many awards institutions are granting, and also how many contact hours students are taking. So to the next slide, Laura. So to the dual enrollment data, we are collecting 2 different types of dual enrollment data. So the first one on the slide is high school students in earlier middle college programs, and this has been kind of a tricky subject for us to get a definition down. So I'm going to kind of explain what we mean by this. When we're talking about early middle college programs, we're specifically talking about early or middle college high schools. So these are high schools that are 100% on a community college campus, and the students are 100. Well, the students are 100% enrolled in a community. All students at these high schools, I should say, are completely enrolled at the community college, and for them, we're collecting enrollment data, again, total and successful credit hours completed, and also how many awards institutions are granting in an academic year. And then we have our other high school dual enrollment or dual credit student data. This is pretty much anything else that is not a student that is at a high school where 100% of the students are enrolled at the community college. So this could be like a la carte dual enrollment, or maybe like a community college has like a early, what they call, like what me and Laura were actually talking about this before we got on the call. In some states, they don't have these early college high schools, so they think their programs where they have like students come for like half a day and they like for their junior senior they get an associate's degree. They think that qualifies, but it doesn't. That's more so what we're considering like in the realm of like what we could call standard dual enrollment. So that's kind of what we're collecting in terms of dual enrollment data. And then also the last box on here, we're also collecting data on industry partnerships because economic developers are really interested in that. And that's something we've gotten a lot of interest from, but it's not necessarily related to dual enrollment. So I won't spend too much time on it. Laura, you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to also say that because of the confusion, as Jacob mentioned, as we did those 10 schools that Jacob talked about were in an initial pilot survey for us. We did that pilot in 2022. Then in 2023, we expanded it to 63 schools. And we realized through that process that we had not defined this well enough. We knew that some of the states didn't have early college high schools, but we got data saying they did. And so it was a kind of a process back and forth. So today you won't see the data broken out between those two, but we're working really hard to get those definitions exactly right, because this is one of the things we are incredibly interested in, especially as states are changing their policies. So for example, in West Virginia, where they've just now recently made it where high schoolers are not going to have to pay to do dual enrollment classes, there are going to be, I believe, some early college high schools built. There already are many of them, obviously, in North Carolina, for anybody that knows that system. And there's a couple in Maryland, a couple in South Carolina. But these are popping up, some as public high schools, some as charter schools. And so it's really important to us in this data collection effort to be able to separate these out, to see really how are these early college high schools, how are they paying off? Are they seeing better outcomes or not? And we're hoping to link this to other data eventually down the road. So,
yep. So, and then I'm about to get into the interesting part of the presentation. But before I do that, I'm going to kind of level set. Again, kind of going back to what I was talking about, like the goal of creating the survey, kind of like what does the Richmond Fed bring to the table? Again, the independence. As we're out talking to community college leadership and other people in the community about who are interested in community colleges, whether that be economic developers or CEOs of companies, we're really seeing that the independence that the Richmond Fed adds is super important. We're a trusted research organization, and we've really seen that our independence really does bring a unique perspective to this conversation. Again, we also don't fund anyone, including community colleges, so there's no money going to community colleges from us. So again, very much we're looking at this from a workforce angle, and people have also found that really valuable as in our conversations. Again, we're a large research organization, so we have a bunch of people who work in research like myself and Laura. We have survey expertise like our colleague Jason Koskow, who Laura highlighted at the beginning of our presentation. And also our, like going back to what Laura was saying about the mandate, this work firmly falls into the maximum employment mandate. So it is very much within our scope of work to be focused on something like this. Also, our goal was to collect data and design metrics that represent community colleges and how they serve their communities. But we also know that what we're doing is not fixing the problem. We're just adding more data points to help inform the conversation. So we know like there's holes, and then like we're providing some data, but even then we're not covering everything. So we're really hoping that we can just add a little bit more color to the situation. So before I get into our extended pilot results, just a couple things. We have Maryland, South Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia represented in these results. Um, Unfortunately, we do not have North Carolina, but we're extremely hopeful that they will be participating in the survey that we run this year. Also, all results and data are experimental and subject to change. So as Laura mentioned, we are refining our definitions and working with the systems and the individual institutional researchers at some schools to figure out the best way we can like describe things and collect data consistently. So just wanted to preface with that before we hop in. So, Laura, you can jump to the next slide. So, one thing, again, from our conversations, we knew that dual enrollment was a big part of student populations at community colleges. And again, this is very important that we're separating this out from iPads because, like Laura said, iPads you can only really look at under age 18 or above it. So we're specifically here looking at dual enrollment data, and we see in Virginia that they have the most as a percent of total credit enrollment when it comes to dual enrollment. And then we have it all the way ranging to Maryland, that's at 13.8%. Also, another note about all the data I'm talking about today, it's for the 2021-2022 academic year. So keep that in mind too. So this is the most recent data available. So Laura, you can go to the next slide. So as expected, and as Laura alluded to, dual enrollment is much higher at rural institutions. And again, Laura touched on a lot of things of like why this is, and it has a lot to do with like how sometimes in rural communities, community college helps subsidize the K through 12 system. And she said, and what was really interesting is when you drill down, look at the school level data, there are some schools in our district that have close to 50% of their credit enrollment as high schoolers. And I think that was like something at least caught me off guard when we looked at the initial results. And it's been really interesting to see how important high school students play in contributing to community college enrollment. So, or we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, I'm gonna add just one thing there too that I think is interesting that is important to point out, and it's one of the reasons in that quiz I asked, like, in how many states can students take classes tuition free. I think there is a misunderstanding by the general population where they think that in these states where students are not paying tuition, that this full tuition is being paid by someone else. So the full tuition is being paid by the school district, or the full tuition is being paid by state or local governments. And one of the things we heard pretty frequently in our outreach was that some of the schools were losing money on dual enrollment in the states where they didn't have funding and they were waiving tuition. But in others, they were just kind of breaking even on it. And so as we talked to schools, and they were telling us, community colleges were telling us, hey, really our biggest growing populations, or in some cases, Jacob, I mean, they were saying like our only growing population is dual enrollment students.
Right.
It's putting them in more of a financially precarious position. And this is not something that is well known by businesses and other like non-education folks or folks that aren't researching education. So one of our roles too in this is to write. We do write a lot about community colleges now, but to put this out there and talk about it in a way so that people are better informed about kind of the truth as it comes to how schools are funded, how these sorts of programs are funded.
Thank you for that, Laura. So like I mentioned, when talking about what type of data we collected, we also collected credit attainment rates. So this is basically the percentage of students that received a passing grade for their coursework. And what we see is that, especially in Maryland and Virginia, the dual enrollment, and again, probably to this audience, not too surprising, the dual enrollment students do much better than the non-dual enrollment students. And even in West Virginia, where it is a little bit lower, it's still at 76%, which is still relatively high and something to note. And also, I think something that's really interesting, and I pulled this number this morning, these successful credit attainment rates are also translating to awards and degrees. Like in our survey, we collected the number of awards granted, and across the 63 schools in this extended pilot that we did, they awarded about 3,500 degrees or credentials to their dual enrollment populations. So these institutions are providing a lot of degrees to a lot of students. And next slide. Thank you, Laura. And then also, like Laura kind of alluded to this a little bit, but policy really matters in this, and it really impacts how dual enrollment works. So this graph here is an example from South Carolina. So all the schools are anonymized. If you can figure out which school is which, I'd be very surprised because I'm not even sure without looking at our cheat sheet who is who. But basically, in South Carolina, dual enrollment policy is a little different than in North Carolina and then some of the other states in our district, to where it's not like the community, it's at the discretion, and Laura, correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's at the discretion of the community college and the school districts to figure out how much to charge, whether they're going to not charge students or they're going to charge students some either lower rate or even full freight at some schools. So what we did here and like through our outreach, we were able to actually identify the schools that did not charge their high school students tuition. And what we see here is that across the board that enrollment is higher at these institutions. I think if you were to aggregate all these schools together into two categories, where it's like the not tuition free and the tuition free, the not tuition free technical colleges in South Carolina, that's what they call them there. 13.1% of the students are high schoolers, but if you look at the tuition free bucket, 21.6 of students are high schoolers. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean like I don't think we're really necessarily making a case of whether or not students should have to pay for dual enrollment. I think the biggest thing here is just showing that these policies really do incentivize behavior, and as economists are very interested in incentives and how policy incentivizes decision making. Um, so as Laura mentioned, we have Maryland and West Virginia in our district, and they just had massive policy that made dual enrollment free to students. So it's really interesting to see as like time goes on how we see shifts in these populations and how does policy affect whether or not a student decides to take dual enrollment.
And Jacob, that made me think, I think you're so right there. And also in both Maryland and West Virginia in their policy changes, there was a certain amount of money set aside in appropriations. Like this is how much this program is going to cost. And I've read that in both cases, it's exceeded that budget already because they underestimated how much that policy would matter, right?
Right.
And it is interesting in some of these schools in South Carolina, very urban, similar places. In one place, you could get an associate degree for free. And there are early college high schools where you can do that, or you can do it on your own through just regular dual enrollment. And then other metro areas where you actually have to pay full tuition to go.
Mm.
And so there certainly are inequities there in terms of how many credits students can earn before going to the state institutions, 4-year institutions if they're transferring. So this is something we're really interested in going forward.
All right, Lori. Okay, sweet. So I think one thing that's again not a surprise to this audience, a common criticism of dual enrollment is that the racial distributions for students across enrollment type is different. So in our survey, we really see that across all of our states. Dual enrollment students tend to be white, Asian, or in our other race category compared to their non-dual enrollment counterparts. Again, one of the unique things we get to do at the Fed is we get to talk to the institution. So they've indicated to us that making these programs more diverse are top priority. And some of these institutions have really taken it to heart because when we drill down to the school level data, we can see some institutions actually don't have this problem. They serve their students very like similarly and like they're very equal in the distributions. So and what are driving these differences, I don't think we're exactly too sure. That's also on another thing that we're interested in digging deeper in and like connecting more data to kind of get a fuller picture of what's going on and driving these differences within our states. So I'll kick it back to you, Laura.
Yeah. So some of that data that Jacob showed, like he said, some of this is like where we're going to dig into next. And so, I would just, and next year we will be able to show it separately for those that are in these early college high schools and those that are in just more traditional dual enrollment, dual credit programs, which I think is going to be very interesting, especially when it comes to award attainment. But there's no doubt that from a workforce perspective, community colleges just play a tremendous role in training workers both in the 5th district and all across the country. And we believe that including the attainment of shorter term credentials, transfers, persistence as success, the idea that we have been just measuring success as just getting an associate degree at a community college is really limiting, right? That's a very limited view on how these students are being served. And by the way, it's not the goal of many of them when they walk in the door. Many of them have the goal of transferring or have the goal of just getting a shorter term credential. We do think state, local, and institutional policy plays a huge role here. And as the Fed, like Jacob said, as an independent, apolitical, nonpartisan research organization, we're really able to kind of sit in the middle between research, which obviously we can do traditional research, but we also are doing a tremendous amount of outreach. We have 121 community colleges in our district, and we've talked to over half of them. And we've engaged with them in pretty deep ways to where we see some of the behavior, some of the ways they're making decisions and how it's impacting students and how they're making decisions. And so we do think policy plays a really tremendous role here. And this next year, the goal is to have all the schools in the 5th district, so all 121 community colleges in the survey. For those of you that are outside of our district, we would love to talk to you because we do plan to expand nationally the following year, as I mentioned. And I do see a question. If you have any more questions, put them in the chat. But I have one question I definitely want to address. But we are writing a ton on community colleges. We have a community college insights kind of blog space where we write things. Jacob just posted what's known, and I posted what's known as a regional matters post this past week on non-credit. We have a post coming out next week about dual enrollment funding and how it's funded in every state, and even just on our across our 5 states. So complicated, right? It is so complicated. Even when you think you understand the code, then you go, and that's written in the state law, you go and talk to the schools and they're like, that's not really how it works, right? Or that's not exactly what happens. And so we're balancing looking at doing outreach and looking at state law, and that will come out next week. And you can scan these QR codes. The one on the left is our website for the survey itself. It has all of our results. And then the one on the left and the one on the right is where you can get to a page that has everything we've written on community colleges. And a good bit of that is on dual enrollment. I do see one question here. It says, when politicians oppose tuition-free dual enrollment, what are their arguments? Who are we arguing against when we push for this? I think this is a great question. I would just say, so I come from a higher education background. I was a professor and college administrator at a 4-year regional public for 12 years before coming to the Fed. And so some of what I'm about to say comes from that experience too. I think when community colleges are pushing for any type of additional funding, if it's funding for dual enrollment, if it's funding for non-credit, if it's funding for fill in the blank, they are battling and pushing against 4-year higher ed and K through 12. So the idea kind of in some people's minds is that it's one pot for education. And so if community colleges get more money, somebody else gets less money. That's kind of like people imagine that as a trade-off. Now, that doesn't always have to be the case, right? I mean, we could grow the pot. But I know even at a regional public institution, it was very difficult for us to do certain things because we were fighting, not fighting against, but pushing up against the flagship universities, right? There is this kind of funding hierarchy that is real. And many of the legislators in the room went to those schools, right? So if you're in the state of South Carolina, I don't know what percentage of the legislature went to Clemson or University of South Carolina, but it's a lot, right? It's very high. Very few went to the technical colleges in the state. So that undoubtedly makes a difference. I think too, like I mentioned, I think there is just extraordinary confusion over how these things are funded. I think that people do not understand. I don't think that the K through 12 counselors who are recommending these programs necessarily know how they are funded. I don't think parents understand how they're funded, the students themselves, probably the people that are teaching the classes at the community colleges. I just don't think people really understand. And my experience through doing this work, and I think Jacob would agree with me, is that people, especially business people, because we talk a lot to a lot of business people too, a lot of corporate folks, they are surprised when they learn the things that we share with them about community colleges and the funding mechanisms. It is not something that they understand. There is a shock there, like, oh, I had no idea. I had no idea they got less per FTE than a 4-year school. They don't really understand. And so I also think we're pushing up against the argument that there's no real problem. If these programs are growing anyway, why do we need to fund them more, right? Doesn't seem like a problem in general. I don't know if that answered your question, Rebecca. Feel free to come off mute if it didn't. But any other questions about the work we're doing or anything else about the things we talked about? Sorry, my mouse slid. Our email addresses are here, and we are continuing our goal this year. So our plan, just to give you a tiny bit of insight about right as we finish up here, is we are planning on doing our 2024 survey, basically for it to be live from May to June, and then process the data after that. And in early fall, we will go live with our expanded results. So we'll have those this fall, like Jacob said, on our website with school level data. That is our goal. We're speaking out loud so that hopefully it will happen. And we're pushing forward very aggressively to make that happen, including a lot of internal IT upgrades. And so we've refined our tool. We're refining the actual information technology that's behind that tool. And we're really excited about what's to come, because we have gotten a lot of interest in this work, not only from the community colleges in our district, but maybe even more importantly, from their point of view, we have gotten interest from legislators. We have gotten interest from funders, other nonprofits, and folks that are really interested in just seeing more about the full way that community colleges are serving people, not just traditional college students, but also high schoolers, also industry partnerships, etc. So thank you guys all for coming, and please reach out. We would love to talk to you.